Hey there! Have you ever wondered if the story we tell about the past is only part of the truth? For as long as we've studied history, we've imagined it as a steady climb, from simple tools to complex machines, from primitive beginnings to modern understanding. But scattered across the world are quiet contradictions, stones cut with impossible precision, structures aligned with the sky in ways that still feel deliberate. Systems built not just to function, but to endure. Tonight, we don't rewrite history. We simply slow down and look again at the gaps, the patterns, and the questions that were never fully answered. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video, subscribe, and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is. Now, let's step gently into a different possibility and explore what might have been forgotten. We leave behind the question of whether something was forgotten to something even more subtle, the way history itself is arranged, as if it moves forward in a straight, predictable line. From the earliest stories we are taught, the past is presented as a gradual progression, simple tools becoming complex, small ideas growing into larger systems, knowledge building steadily over time until it reaches the present. It is a comforting structure, one that makes the world feel ordered, understandable, and continuous. But when we begin to look more closely, when we slow down and examine the details rather than the outline, small irregularities begin to appear, moments where that smooth line seems to bend, where something appears earlier than expected, or more refined than it should be, creating a quiet tension between what we are told and what we observe. These moments are not always dramatic. They do not announce themselves as contradictions. Instead, they sit within the timeline, often explained, sometimes overlooked, but rarely fully resolved, creating a subtle sense that the story may not be as seamless as it appears. The idea of linear progress suggests that each stage builds directly on the one before it, that tools improve step by step, that knowledge expands in a continuous flow. But across different periods of history, we encounter sudden leaps, developments that seem to emerge without a clear sequence of gradual improvement leading up to them. In some cases, entire systems appear already refined, as if the process of experimentation that would normally precede them is missing or compressed into a space that is not clearly visible. This does not mean that such processes did not occur, but it does mean that the evidence for them is not always present in the way we expect. When we look at certain ancient structures, for example, we see levels of precision, alignment, and durability that feel fully realized, not tentative or experimental, but confident, as if the methods behind them were already understood and practiced. This creates a contrast with the idea of gradual development, where early attempts are usually marked by inconsistency, by variation, by signs of learning through trial and error. Instead, what we sometimes find are results that appear complete from the moment they enter the record, leaving us to reconstruct the steps that must have come before, even when those steps are not clearly documented. This leads to another aspect of the problem, the way certain achievements appear out of place within their historical context. When we examine tools, materials, and methods associated with a particular period, we form expectations about what should be possible within those constraints. These expectations are based on evidence, on artifacts, on the technologies that have been identified and studied, but occasionally the results do not align neatly with those expectations. A structure may display a level of precision that seems difficult to achieve with the tools we believe were available. A system may demonstrate an understanding of environment or geometry that feels more advanced than the surrounding context suggests. These instances do not necessarily overturn established explanations, but they do create points of friction where the connection between means and outcome is not entirely clear. To address this, additional explanations are often proposed, refinements to existing theories, new interpretations of how tools were used, how labor was organized, how time was allocated. These explanations can be convincing, supported by experiments and reconstructions that show what is possible under certain conditions. But even with these efforts, a small gap sometimes remains, not large enough to disrupt the overall narrative, but present enough to suggest that the full picture may be more complex than a straightforward progression. The presence of gaps in historical records adds another layer to this complexity. Much of what we know about the past comes from what has been preserved, structures that remain standing, artifacts that have survived, texts that have been recorded and maintained. But preservation is not uniform. Some materials endure while others decay. Some records are kept while others are lost. Entire periods can be represented by fragments, pieces of a larger story that must be assembled without complete information. This means that the timeline we construct is not a continuous record, but a reconstruction, a framework built from available evidence, shaped by what has survived rather than by everything that once existed. Within this framework, gaps are inevitable, places where information is missing, where connections must be inferred rather than directly observed. These gaps do not necessarily indicate that something unusual occurred, but they do create spaces where uncertainty exists, where multiple interpretations are possible. In some cases, what appears to be a sudden breakthrough may simply be the first surviving example of a process that had been developing for some time, with earlier stages lost to history. In other cases, it may reflect a genuine concentration of innovation, a period where conditions allowed for rapid advancement. Distinguishing between these possibilities is not always straightforward, especially when the evidence is limited. The challenge lies in recognizing the difference between what is known, what is inferred, and what remains uncertain. Another factor to consider is the way knowledge is transmitted across generations. In modern contexts, information is often recorded in detail, stored in ways that allow for retrieval and replication. But in many ancient societies, knowledge was passed down through practice, through apprenticeship, through direct experience rather than written documentation. This form of transmission can be highly effective, preserving techniques with precision, but it is also vulnerable to disruption. If the chain of transmission is broken, if a community changes, disperses, or disappears, the knowledge associated with it can be lost, even if the results of that knowledge remain visible in the structures or artifacts that survive. This creates a situation where we can observe the outcome without fully understanding the process, where the evidence of capability remains, but the methods behind it are no longer accessible. When we place all of these elements together, sudden developments, out-of-place achievements, gaps in records, and the fragility of knowledge transmission, the timeline of history begins to feel less like a smooth line and more like a series of segments, connected but not always evenly, with variations in density, clarity, and continuity. This does not mean that the overall progression is incorrect, but it suggests that it may be more complex than a simple, uninterrupted flow. There may be periods of acceleration, where knowledge advances quickly, followed by periods of stability or even decline, where certain techniques are maintained, transformed, or forgotten. These variations create a pattern that is not strictly linear, but dynamic, influenced by factors that extend beyond the accumulation of knowledge alone. As we sit with this idea, the question that emerges is not whether history is wrong, but whether it is complete in the way we imagine it to be. The timeline provides a structure, a way of organizing events and developments, but it may not capture every detail, every transition, every process that contributed to what we see today. It may smooth over irregularities, connecting points that are separated by gaps, creating a narrative that is coherent but not exhaustive. And in those gaps, in those moments where the line becomes less clear, there is space for reconsideration, not to replace the existing understanding, but to expand it, to allow for the possibility that the past may hold complexities that are not fully visible within the framework we have constructed. And as that possibility settles in quietly, without urgency, the timeline itself begins to shift, not collapsing, not breaking but opening slightly, revealing that history may not be as continuous as we think, and that within its structure there may be more to explore than what is immediately apparent. We leave behind a timeline that may not be as smooth as it appears, to something more grounded, more tangible, the tools themselves, the objects we believe shaped the ancient world. When we imagine early civilizations, we often picture simplicity: stone tools chipped by hand, bronze implements cast in basic forms, ropes, wood, and human effort working together to build what we now see as monumental achievements. This image is not incorrect. It is supported by evidence, by artifacts that have been discovered, preserved, and studied over time. We have found chisels, hammers, copper saws, wooden sledges, ropes made from plant fibers, and other tools that reflect the materials and technologies available during different periods. These tools form the foundation of our understanding, creating a framework that defines what should have been possible within the limits of those materials. But when we place this framework alongside the results, the structures, the precision, the scale, a subtle tension begins to emerge, not as a contradiction, but as a question about how these tools were used, how far their capabilities extend, and whether our understanding of them fully captures what was achieved. Stone tools, for example, are often associated with early construction, used to shape and cut materials through repeated impact. They are effective, capable of breaking, chipping, and gradually refining surfaces. Bronze tools, introduced later, offer advantages in durability and sharpness, allowing for more controlled cutting and shaping. Copper, while softer, can be used for finer work, particularly when combined with abrasives like sand to enhance its cutting ability. These tools, when used with skill and patience, can produce remarkable results. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that it is possible to cut stone, shape blocks, and even achieve relatively smooth surfaces using these methods. But the process is often slow, requiring significant time and effort, and the results, while impressive, do not always match the level of precision observed in certain ancient structures. In some cases, stones are fitted together with such accuracy that the gaps between them are nearly invisible, their surfaces aligned so closely that they behave as a single unit. Achieving this level of precision with simple tools is not impossible, but it raises questions about consistency, about how such results could be repeated across large numbers of stones, across entire structures, without visible variation. This is where explanations begin to stretch, not because they are incorrect, but because they must account for a level of control and repetition that is difficult to demonstrate on a large scale. The tools themselves do not change, but the way they are applied must be refined to a degree that is not always fully documented. Another aspect to consider is the hardness of materials. Stone used in construction varies widely, from softer limestone to harder granite and basalt. Cutting softer stone with bronze or copper tools is relatively straightforward, especially when combined with abrasives. But working with harder materials presents additional challenges. Granite, for example, is significantly more resistant, requiring either harder tools or more time and effort to shape. Evidence suggests that ancient builders used a combination of techniques, including pounding with harder stones, grinding with abrasives, and possibly using simple drilling methods to create holes or refine surfaces. These methods can produce results, but they are labor-intensive and require a high level of skill to achieve consistent outcomes. When we see finely shaped granite blocks or precisely drilled holes in such materials, the question is not whether they could have been made, but how the process was managed, how the tools were maintained, how the work was organized to achieve such uniformity across multiple pieces. The scale of construction adds another layer to this discussion. Moving from individual tools to entire structures requires coordination, planning, and the ability to apply techniques consistently across large teams. If a single artisan can achieve a high level of precision on a small object, scaling that process to hundreds or thousands of elements introduces new challenges. Variations in skill, differences in material, and the complexity of organizing labor all influence the final result. Yet in many ancient sites we observe a level of consistency that suggests these challenges were addressed effectively, that systems were in place to maintain quality and alignment across large projects. These systems are not always visible in the artifacts themselves, but their effects are evident in the structures that remain. The absence of detailed records describing these processes means that we must infer how they worked, reconstructing methods based on the results rather than direct documentation. This reconstruction is often supported by experiments where modern researchers attempt to replicate ancient techniques using similar tools. These experiments provide valuable insights, demonstrating what is possible, highlighting the skill required, and offering plausible explanations for certain features. But they also reveal the effort involved, the time required, and the variability that can occur even under controlled conditions. When these experimental results are compared to the consistency seen in ancient structures, the gap between possibility and replication becomes apparent, not as a failure of the explanation, but as an indication that the full context of the original work may include factors that are not easily reproduced. These factors could include the level of specialization among workers, the organization of tasks, the accumulation of experience over generations, and the integration of techniques into a cohesive system. The tools themselves may be simple, but their effectiveness depends on how they are used, how they are maintained, and how knowledge of their use is shared and preserved. Another point of tension arises when considering the absence of certain intermediate stages. In many areas of development, we expect to see a progression, early examples that show less precision, gradual improvements that lead to more refined results. While such progressions do exist in some cases, there are also instances where the earliest surviving examples already display a high level of sophistication, with fewer visible signs of experimentation or transition. This does not necessarily mean that earlier stages did not exist, but it does suggest that they have not been preserved or identified, leaving a gap in the sequence that must be filled through inference. This gap contributes to the sense that some achievements appear suddenly without a clear build-up, creating the impression of a leap rather than a gradual climb. As we consider all of these elements, the tools, the materials, the scale, the consistency, and the gaps in evidence, the question begins to take shape. Do the tools we have identified fully account for the results we see, or is there more to the process than what is immediately visible? The answer is not straightforward. The tools are real, the methods are plausible, and the results can be explained within this framework, but the level of precision and consistency observed in certain cases suggests that the application of these tools was highly refined, perhaps more so than we typically imagine when we think of ancient technology. This refinement may not be captured fully in the tools themselves, but in the knowledge of how to use them, in the techniques that were developed and practiced over time, in the systems that allowed for their consistent application. And as we sit with this idea, the image of a world without machines begins to shift slightly, not becoming more complex in terms of technology, but deeper in terms of understanding. The tools remain simple, but the way they were used may have been anything but, suggesting that the gap between what we see and what we understand is not in the materials, but in the methods, in the space where knowledge was applied with a level of precision that we are still trying to fully grasp, leaving us with a quiet realization that the tools may not always match the results, not because they are insufficient, but because the way they were used may be more advanced than we have yet fully reconstructed. We leave behind the tools that shaped the ancient world to something more difficult to measure, the results those tools produced, results that sometimes feel strangely familiar, not ancient, but precise in a way we associate with modern methods. When we look at certain structures, whether high in the Andes or along the edge of the Nile, what stands out is not only their scale or endurance, but the quiet accuracy built into them. The way stone meets stone, the way lines hold their direction, the way entire structures align with forces that are not visible but can still be measured. This kind of precision does not announce itself loudly. It is often subtle, noticed only when we slow down, when we look closely at the details rather than the overall form. And in those details, a question begins to take shape, not about what was built, but how closely it was controlled, how exact the process must have been to produce results that still hold their form thousands of years later. In places like Machu Picchu, stones are shaped in ways that seem to ignore standardization. They are not uniform blocks, not cut into identical shapes that can be repeated easily. Instead, each stone is unique, with multiple angles and surfaces that must align perfectly with the stones around it. The joints between them are so tight that even thin objects cannot pass through, and yet there is no mortar holding them together. The stability of the structure comes entirely from the precision of the fit, from the way each surface meets the next with exact contact. This kind of construction requires more than just shaping individual stones. It requires an understanding of how those stones will interact, how pressure will be distributed across uneven surfaces, how small adjustments can affect the overall alignment. It suggests a process where stones were not simply cut and placed, but repeatedly adjusted, tested, and refined until the desired fit was achieved. This level of interaction between material and design creates a form of precision that is not based on uniformity but on relationship, where each element is defined by how it connects to the others. In ancient Egypt, a different form of precision appears, one that relies more on geometry and alignment. The pyramids, particularly those at Giza, are oriented with remarkable accuracy to the cardinal directions, their sides aligned almost perfectly with north, south, east, and west. This alignment is not approximate. It falls within a margin that is difficult to achieve even with modern instruments, especially when working on such a large scale. The base of the Great Pyramid is leveled to within a very small tolerance despite covering a vast area, and its sides rise at consistent angles, maintaining their proportions across the entire structure. These features suggest careful planning, measurement, and execution, a process that required not only knowledge of geometry, but the ability to apply that knowledge consistently across a large project. The question is not whether such precision is possible, but how it was achieved with the tools available at the time. Without advanced surveying equipment, without modern measuring devices, the builders would have relied on simpler methods, sighting along lines, using reference points, observing the movement of the sun and stars. These methods can be effective, but they require patience, repetition, and a deep understanding of how small errors can accumulate over distance. Maintaining accuracy across such a scale suggests a level of control that is not immediately obvious from the tools themselves. Beyond these well-known examples, there are countless smaller details that reflect the same attention to precision. In some ancient sites, holes drilled into stone are remarkably straight and uniform, their edges clean, their depth consistent. Surfaces that appear flat at a distance reveal subtle curvature when measured, suggesting intentional shaping rather than simple smoothing. Blocks are aligned in ways that distribute weight evenly, reducing stress and increasing stability over time. These details are not always visible without close inspection, but they contribute to the overall performance of the structure, allowing it to endure environmental changes, seismic activity, and the passage of time. The presence of such details indicates that precision was not limited to visible features, but extended into aspects of construction that serve functional purposes, reinforcing the idea that accuracy was an integral part of the design process. When we attempt to replicate some of these features today using modern tools, the results can be impressive, but they often highlight the effort required to achieve similar levels of accuracy. Machines can produce precise cuts quickly, but they rely on calibration, on controlled conditions, on systems that maintain consistency. When working by hand, achieving comparable precision requires skill, experience, and a process that allows for continuous adjustment. The challenge is not only in making a single accurate cut, but in repeating that accuracy across multiple elements, ensuring that each piece fits within a larger system without introducing cumulative error. This is where the idea of tolerance becomes important. Tolerance refers to the allowable variation in a measurement, the degree to which a result can deviate from a target value while still functioning as intended. In many ancient structures, the tolerances appear to be very tight, meaning that variations are minimal, that the results are consistently close to the intended design. Maintaining such tolerances without modern measuring tools suggests that the builders had effective ways of checking and correcting their work, methods that allowed them to identify deviations and adjust accordingly before they became significant. These methods may not have been recorded in detail, but their effects are visible in the structures that remain. Another aspect of this precision is its relationship to time. Modern construction often prioritizes speed, using tools and techniques that allow for rapid production. In contrast, ancient construction may have operated on different timelines, where the emphasis was not on completing a project quickly, but on achieving a desired level of quality. This does not mean that time was unlimited, but that the allocation of effort may have been structured differently, allowing for processes that involve repeated refinement rather than rapid execution. This approach can produce results that are highly accurate, but it requires organization, planning, and a commitment to maintaining standards over extended periods. The presence of such precision in ancient structures suggests that these conditions were met, that systems were in place to support work that required patience and consistency. As we consider all of these elements, the fitted stones, the aligned structures, the tight tolerances, the question begins to shift. It is no longer simply about whether ancient builders could achieve precision, but about how that precision was understood and applied. The tools themselves may be simple, but the way they were used reflects a level of knowledge that is not immediately visible, a combination of observation, experience, and technique that allows for results that feel unexpectedly modern. This does not imply that ancient builders had access to the same technologies we use today, but it does suggest that their approach to accuracy may have been more advanced than we typically assume. Not in terms of machines, but in terms of method, in the way they interacted with materials, in the way they controlled variables, in the way they maintained consistency across complex systems. And as this realization settles in quietly, without disrupting the overall picture, the sense of familiarity begins to make more sense, not because the past mirrors the present, but because precision itself is not limited to any one period. It is a principle that can be achieved through different means. And in the ancient world, it appears to have been achieved in ways that we are still working to fully understand, leaving us with the quiet awareness that accuracy does not always require advanced tools, but it does require a depth of knowledge that may not be as simple as we once thought. We leave behind precision that feels almost modern, to something heavier, slower, and far more difficult to explain, the movement of massive stone, not just shaped with care, but transported across distances that seem to resist simple explanation. Around the world, we find evidence of megaliths, stones so large that even imagining their movement becomes an exercise in scale. Blocks weighing dozens, sometimes hundreds of tons, positioned with accuracy in places where the terrain itself presents obstacles, hills, rivers, uneven ground, and yet somehow these stones arrived, were placed, and became part of structures that still stand today. The question is not whether movement was possible, but how it was achieved consistently across multiple locations under conditions that appear to push against the limits of the tools and methods we associate with those periods. On Easter Island, the Moai statues rise from the ground with a quiet presence, their forms carved from volcanic rock and transported from quarries that lie kilometers away from where they now stand. Some of these statues weigh more than 80 tons, their height extending several meters above the surface, with additional mass hidden beneath the ground. The terrain between the quarry and the final positions is not flat or uniform. It includes slopes, uneven surfaces, and areas that would require careful navigation to move such weight without losing control. The prevailing explanation suggests that these statues were either dragged horizontally using ropes and sledges or moved upright by rocking them forward, a process sometimes described as walking. Experimental attempts have demonstrated that both methods can work under controlled conditions, with groups coordinating their efforts to shift the statues incrementally. But when we consider the full scale of the operation, the number of statues, the distances involved, the need to repeat the process multiple times, the explanation begins to feel stretched, not impossible, but demanding a level of coordination, endurance, and precision that raises further questions about how such efforts were sustained over time. The pyramids of Egypt present a similar challenge, though in a different context. The stones used in their construction vary in size, but many are large enough to require significant effort to move, particularly when transported from quarries that are not immediately adjacent to the building site. Limestone blocks, granite elements, and other materials had to be extracted, shaped, and then moved across distances that could involve both land and water. The most commonly accepted methods involve the use of sledges pulled over prepared surfaces, possibly lubricated with water to reduce friction, combined with ramps that allowed stones to be raised gradually to higher levels. These methods are supported by evidence, including depictions in ancient art and experimental reconstructions that show how such movement could be achieved. But once again, the scale introduces complexity. Moving a single block under controlled conditions is one thing. Moving thousands, maintaining alignment, coordinating labor, and doing so within a time frame that allowed for the completion of the structure requires a system that goes beyond simple force. It requires organization, planning, and a method of execution that ensures consistency across repeated actions. When we compare the weight of these stones to the available technology, the contrast becomes more apparent. Without wheels designed for heavy loads, without metal machinery capable of lifting and stabilizing large masses, the primary sources of movement would have been human and animal power, combined with simple mechanical aids like levers and rollers. These tools can amplify force, allowing smaller groups to move larger objects, but they also introduce limitations. Rollers, for example, require relatively smooth surfaces and continuous adjustment as the object moves forward. Sledges can distribute weight, but they depend on friction reduction to remain efficient. Ramps must be constructed and maintained, adding another layer of labor to the process. Each of these methods is viable, but when applied at scale, they require careful coordination to avoid inefficiencies, delays, or structural issues. The fact that such large-scale projects were completed suggests that these challenges were addressed effectively, but the details of how this was managed are not always fully visible in the archaeological record. Experimental archaeology has attempted to bridge this gap, recreating ancient methods using similar tools and conditions to understand how these feats might have been accomplished. These experiments are valuable, demonstrating that with enough people, time, and coordination, large stones can indeed be moved. Groups have successfully transported blocks using sledges, ropes, and lubrication, showing that the basic principles are sound. But these experiments often take place under controlled conditions, with modern understanding guiding the process, with safety measures in place, and with a clear goal defined from the start. When we compare these controlled demonstrations to the ancient reality, where variables such as terrain, weather, resource availability, and human factors would have influenced the outcome, the gap between demonstration and sustained application becomes more noticeable. It is one thing to show that something can be done. It is another to show how it was done repeatedly, reliably, and on a scale that produced entire complexes of stone structures. Another layer of complexity comes from the precision required during placement. Moving a massive stone to a general location is only part of the process. Positioning it accurately, aligning it with other stones, ensuring stability, and integrating it into a larger structure requires control at a level that goes beyond brute force. This suggests that the movement and placement processes were closely linked, that the same systems used to transport the stones also allowed for fine adjustments, enabling builders to position each piece with care. This integration of movement and precision implies a method that balances strength with control, a way of handling large masses that allows for both power and subtlety. As we consider all of these elements, the weight of the stones, the limitations of available technology, the scale of the projects and the results that were achieved, the idea that effort alone explains everything begins to feel incomplete. Effort is certainly a part of the equation. The labor required would have been immense, involving large groups working together over extended periods. But effort without method can lead to inefficiency, to inconsistency, to results that vary from one instance to another. The consistency observed in many ancient structures suggests that effort was guided by systems, by techniques that allowed for reliable outcomes, by knowledge that ensured each step of the process contributed effectively to the final result. This knowledge may not be fully preserved in written form, but it is reflected in the structures themselves, in the way stones are positioned, in the patterns that repeat across different sites. And as we sit with this understanding, the image of ancient builders struggling against impossible weight begins to shift. The stones remain heavy, the distances remain significant, but the process behind their movement appears more refined than a simple application of force. It suggests a balance between effort and understanding, where knowledge of materials, terrain, and technique allows for results that might otherwise seem unattainable. And in that balance, the question settles quietly, not as a challenge, but as a reflection, whether moving the impossible was ever just about strength, or whether it required something more, a system of knowledge that made the weight itself less of an obstacle than we imagine. We leave behind the movement of massive stone to something quieter, almost invisible, yet just as complex, the movement of water, controlled, guided, and shaped in ways that seem to defy the unpredictability of the natural world. In many ancient sites, what stands out is not only what rises above the ground, but what flows beneath it, systems designed not just to survive environmental conditions, but to manage them with a level of precision that feels unexpectedly refined. Water, by its nature, resists control. It follows gravity, seeks the lowest point, spreads when uncontained, erodes when obstructed, and disappears when not preserved. To work with it requires observation, patience, and an understanding of patterns that unfold over time. And yet in places like Angkor Wat, Petra, and underground cities carved into the earth, we find evidence of systems that do exactly that, not reacting to water, but directing it, storing it, protecting against it, and sustaining life through its careful management. At Angkor Wat, the scale of water management extends far beyond the temple itself. The surrounding landscape is part of a vast network of reservoirs, canals, and channels designed to capture seasonal rainfall and redistribute it across the region. This system operates on multiple levels: large barrays that store water during the monsoon season, smaller channels that distribute it to agricultural areas, and drainage systems that prevent excess accumulation from damaging structures. The balance required to maintain such a system is delicate. Too much water and the land becomes unstable, structures weaken, and erosion begins. Too little, and crops fail, and the system loses its purpose. The fact that this balance was maintained over long periods suggests an understanding of environmental cycles, of how water moves through soil, how it can be stored without stagnation, and how it can be released gradually to support both agriculture and architecture. The temple itself is surrounded by a moat, which serves both symbolic and functional purposes. It represents a cosmic ocean in the temple's design, but it also stabilizes the ground, regulating groundwater levels and protecting the foundations from shifting. This dual role, symbolic and practical, reflects a way of thinking where function and meaning are not separate, but integrated into a single system. In Petra, the challenge is reversed. Instead of managing abundance, the focus is on scarcity, on capturing and preserving water in a desert environment where rainfall is limited and unpredictable. The Nabateans developed a network of channels carved into rock, directing water from distant sources into storage areas within the city. These channels are not random grooves, but carefully designed pathways that control the speed and direction of flow, preventing erosion while maximizing collection. Dams and diversion systems protect the city from flash floods, which can move with sudden force through narrow valleys, carrying debris and causing damage. By redirecting these flows, the system transforms a potential threat into a resource, capturing water that would otherwise be lost. The storage systems within Petra allow water to be retained over time, providing a stable supply that supports daily life in an environment where natural availability is inconsistent. This level of control requires more than just construction. It requires an understanding of how water behaves under different conditions, how it responds to changes in terrain, how it can be guided without being forced into instability. The precision of these systems suggests that this understanding was not accidental, but developed through observation and refinement, applied consistently across the landscape. Underground cities, such as those found in Cappadocia, present yet another approach to water management, one that operates entirely out of sight. In these environments, water must be accessed and distributed within enclosed spaces where natural flow is limited and ventilation is constrained. Wells are integrated into the structure, reaching groundwater sources that can be used by those living below the surface. Drainage systems prevent accumulation, ensuring that water does not compromise the stability of the carved spaces. The integration of water supply and waste management within these underground environments reflects a level of planning that anticipates long-term habitation, not just temporary refuge. These systems must function continuously without direct access to surface conditions, requiring reliability and adaptability. The presence of such systems suggests that the builders were not only aware of immediate needs, but of how those needs would evolve over time, how water usage would change, how maintenance would be managed within a confined environment. Across these different contexts, abundance, scarcity, and isolation, a common theme emerges. Water is not treated as an unpredictable force to be avoided, but as a system to be understood and integrated. The structures built around it do not simply react to its presence, but incorporate it into their design, using it to enhance stability, support life, and maintain balance. This integration reflects a level of environmental awareness that extends beyond immediate survival. It suggests a perspective where the landscape is not separate from the built environment, but part of a continuous system, where natural processes are observed, interpreted, and applied in ways that create long-term sustainability. This sustainability is particularly striking when we consider the longevity of these systems. Many of them functioned effectively for centuries, maintaining balance across changing conditions, supporting populations, and preserving structures over time. This durability is not accidental. It reflects a design approach that accounts for variation, that allows for flexibility within the system, that avoids reliance on single points of failure. Redundancy, distribution, and adaptability are built into the design, ensuring that the system can continue to function even as conditions shift. This kind of resilience is often associated with modern engineering, but its presence in ancient systems suggests that similar principles were understood and applied in different forms. The question that arises from all of this is not simply how these systems were built, but how the knowledge behind them was developed and maintained. Understanding water requires observation over long periods, recognizing patterns that repeat across seasons, identifying variables that influence flow, storage, and distribution. This knowledge may not have been recorded in written form, but it was clearly present in practice, embedded in the design and construction of the systems themselves. The ability to apply this knowledge consistently across different environments and challenges suggests a level of expertise that goes beyond trial and error, reflecting a structured approach to problem-solving that integrates observation, experimentation, and refinement. As we sit with this understanding, the idea of ancient water systems begins to shift. They are no longer seen as simple solutions to immediate problems, but as complex networks that reflect a deep relationship with the environment. They reveal a way of thinking that does not separate human activity from natural processes, but aligns them, creating systems that work with the landscape rather than against it. And in that alignment, the question settles quietly, not as a challenge, but as a reflection. Whether these systems were simply practical responses to environmental conditions, or whether they represent a level of understanding that reaches deeper than we usually imagine, suggesting that the knowledge of how to live with the environment may have been more advanced than we have yet fully recognized. We leave behind systems that controlled water with quiet precision to something even more enduring, structures that seem to resist time itself, not simply surviving it, but adapting to it, holding their form across centuries of change, pressure, and movement. When we think about ancient buildings, it is easy to focus on their age, to see them as fragile remnants that have somehow lasted longer than expected. But when we look more closely, a different picture begins to emerge, one where these structures were not built with the expectation of decay, but with an awareness of forces that would act upon them: earthquakes, shifting ground, weather, and time itself. They were not simply designed to stand in stillness, but to respond, to absorb, to endure. This suggests a level of understanding that goes beyond construction, reaching into the behavior of materials, the movement of the earth, and the long-term interaction between structure and environment. In regions prone to earthquakes, this understanding becomes particularly visible. At Machu Picchu, the same stonework that reflects precision also contributes to resilience. The walls are built with stones that fit tightly together, but without mortar, allowing for slight movement during seismic activity. Instead of resisting the force of an earthquake rigidly, the structure can shift subtly, absorbing energy and then settling back into place. The irregular shapes of the stones, often seen as a challenge in construction, become an advantage in this context, as they interlock in ways that distribute stress across multiple points. This distribution reduces the likelihood of catastrophic failure, allowing the structure to remain intact even as the ground beneath it moves. The foundations are also carefully prepared, with layers that promote drainage and stability, preventing water from weakening the base over time. These elements work together, not as isolated features, but as part of a system that anticipates movement rather than ignoring it. In Japan, traditional wooden architecture offers another example of structures designed to respond to earthquakes. While not as ancient as some of the stone constructions we have discussed, these buildings incorporate principles that reflect a similar understanding: flexible joints, balanced weight distribution, and the ability to sway without collapsing all contribute to their resilience. The use of wood, a material that can bend without breaking, contrasts with the rigidity of stone, but the underlying principle is the same, allowing movement to occur without leading to failure. This idea that strength does not always come from resistance but from controlled flexibility appears in different forms across cultures, suggesting that the behavior of structures under stress was observed and understood in ways that informed design choices. The longevity of ancient builds further reinforces this idea. Structures like the pyramids of Egypt have stood for thousands of years, exposed to environmental conditions that would degrade less carefully constructed forms. The materials used, limestone, granite, and other stones, are durable, but durability alone does not explain their preservation. The way these materials are assembled, the precision of their placement, the distribution of weight, and the alignment of the structure all contribute to its ability to endure. The base of the Great Pyramid, for example, is not only level, but positioned in a way that distributes weight evenly across its foundation, reducing stress points that could lead to collapse. The internal structure, with its chambers and passageways, is arranged to maintain balance, ensuring that the mass above is supported effectively. These design choices reflect an understanding of how forces act within a structure, how weight is transferred, and how stability can be maintained over time. Materials themselves also play a crucial role, not just in their selection, but in how they are treated and combined. In many ancient structures, stones are chosen and shaped in ways that enhance their natural properties. Surfaces are finished to improve contact, reducing gaps that could weaken the structure. In some cases, materials are arranged to allow for slight expansion and contraction, accommodating changes in temperature without causing damage. These considerations suggest that builders were not only aware of the immediate properties of materials, but of how those properties would behave over time under varying conditions. This long-term perspective is a key element in understanding why these structures have lasted. They were not built for immediate use alone, but with an awareness of how they would change, how they would interact with their environment, and how they could be designed to remain stable despite those changes. When modern engineers study these ancient structures, they often find that the techniques used are both simple and sophisticated at the same time. Simple in the sense that they do not rely on advanced machinery or complex materials, but sophisticated in the way they integrate multiple factors into a cohesive design. This integration is what makes them difficult to replicate in some cases. It is not that the individual elements are beyond our understanding, but that the combination of those elements, the balance between them, and the way they are applied consistently across a structure requires a level of coordination and knowledge that is not always captured in modern approaches. Modern construction often separates different aspects of design, structural engineering, material science, environmental considerations into specialized fields, each with its own methods and tools. In ancient construction, these aspects may have been more integrated, with knowledge applied holistically rather than in isolated components. This integration allows for solutions that are efficient, adaptable, and resilient, but also more difficult to analyze in terms of individual contributions. Another aspect to consider is maintenance and adaptation over time. Some ancient structures have been preserved not only because of their original design, but because they were maintained, repaired, and adapted by successive generations. This continuity of care contributes to their longevity, ensuring that small issues are addressed before they become larger problems. However, even in cases where maintenance has been minimal, many structures remain remarkably intact, suggesting that their initial design provided a strong foundation for long-term stability. This combination of design and maintenance reflects a broader approach to building, one that considers not only the act of construction, but the life cycle of the structure, how it will be used, how it will age, and how it can be preserved. As we bring these observations together, the idea of structures that resist time begins to take on a deeper meaning. It is not simply about durability, about materials that last longer than expected. It is about a way of building that anticipates change, that incorporates flexibility, balance, and integration into the design, creating systems that can endure not because they are static, but because they are responsive. This responsiveness allows them to adapt to forces that would otherwise lead to failure, to absorb energy, to distribute stress, to maintain stability even as conditions shift. And in this responsiveness, there is a quiet suggestion that the builders understood something fundamental about the relationship between structure and environment, something that goes beyond immediate function and into the realm of long-term resilience. As we sit with this idea, the image of ancient structures as fragile remnants begins to fade, replaced by a sense of intention, of design choices that were made with awareness of time, of forces that extend beyond a single moment. These structures were not simply built to stand, but to last, to remain present across generations, carrying within them the knowledge of how to endure. And in that endurance, the question lingers, not as a challenge, but as a reflection, whether this longevity is the result of simple materials used well, or whether it reflects a deeper understanding of time, structure, and environment that we are still learning to fully appreciate. We leave behind structures that endure the forces of time to something even more subtle, the way those structures are positioned, not just on the earth, but in relation to the sky above it. When we begin to look at ancient sites through this lens, a quiet pattern starts to emerge, one that is not immediately visible from the ground, but becomes clearer when we consider direction, light, and the movement of celestial bodies. Across different cultures and continents, structures appear to align with events that repeat with precision: the rising of the sun on specific days, the setting of light along defined axes, the position of stars that shift slowly across the night sky. These alignments are not always obvious at first glance, but when observed over time, they reveal a level of consistency that suggests intention rather than coincidence, a deliberate effort to connect what is built on Earth with patterns that exist far beyond it. At Stonehenge, this connection is most visible during the summer solstice, when the rising sun aligns with the heel stone, casting light into the center of the structure in a way that feels almost choreographed. The arrangement of stones creates a corridor for light, guiding it along a path that is defined not by walls, but by open space. This alignment is not approximate. It occurs with a level of accuracy that indicates careful observation of the sun's movement across the horizon, tracking its position over the course of the year until a pattern could be established and fixed within the structure. The same site also marks the winter solstice, with the setting sun aligning in the opposite direction, creating a balance between the longest and shortest days. This dual alignment suggests that the builders were not only aware of these events, but considered them significant enough to be embedded within the design of the structure itself. The question that follows is not simply how they achieved this alignment, but how they identified the precise points at which the sun would rise and set on these specific days, given that such observations require time, repetition, and a method of recording positions across long periods. In Egypt, the pyramids present a different kind of alignment, one that is less about specific moments and more about overall orientation. The sides of the Great Pyramid are aligned with remarkable precision to the cardinal directions: north, south, east, and west. This alignment is so accurate that even small deviations are measurable, suggesting that the builders had a reliable method for determining direction, likely based on observations of the stars rather than the sun alone. The circumpolar stars, which rotate around a fixed point in the sky, provide a stable reference for identifying true north, but using them effectively requires an understanding of their movement, their positions at different times of night and year, and a method for translating that observation into a fixed point on the ground. Achieving this alignment across such a large structure implies that these observations were not only made, but applied consistently during construction, maintaining orientation as the structure rose layer by layer. Beyond these well-known examples, there are other sites where alignments appear to extend beyond the sun and into the realm of stars. Some researchers have suggested that the layout of the pyramids at Giza corresponds to the pattern of Orion's belt, a group of stars that have been associated with mythological significance in ancient Egyptian culture. While this interpretation is debated, it reflects a broader idea that celestial patterns may have influenced the arrangement of structures on the ground. Whether or not specific correlations can be confirmed, the presence of star-related symbolism in ancient cultures suggests that the sky was not only observed, but interpreted, integrated into systems of belief and design. This integration may not always be direct or literal, but it indicates a relationship between observation and meaning, where patterns in the sky are reflected in patterns on the earth. When we expand our view beyond individual sites, a more complex picture begins to form. Across different regions, structures are aligned with similar events: solstices, equinoxes, cardinal directions, creating a sense of repetition that spans cultures and distances. This repetition raises the question of whether these alignments were developed independently through similar processes of observation, or whether there was some form of shared understanding that influenced their use. The idea of independent discovery is supported by the universality of the sky. The sun, the moon, and the stars are visible to all, their movements consistent and predictable over time. Given enough observation, it is possible for different cultures to identify the same patterns and incorporate them into their structures. At the same time, the consistency of certain alignments, particularly when combined with similar geometric principles, suggests that there may be underlying approaches to observation and design that are shared, whether through direct contact or through parallel development. The process of achieving these alignments would have required more than casual observation. Tracking the position of the sun on the horizon, for example, involves marking its rising or setting point over many days, identifying the extremes of its movement, and determining the midpoint between them. This process must be repeated over multiple years to account for variations and ensure accuracy. Similarly, using stars to determine direction requires observing their movement across the night sky, identifying consistent reference points, and translating those observations into fixed alignments on the ground. These methods do not require advanced instruments, but they do require time, patience, and a systematic approach to recording and interpreting data. The presence of accurate alignments in ancient structures suggests that such processes were in place, that observation was not random but organized, that knowledge was accumulated and applied with care. Another aspect to consider is the integration of these alignments into the structure itself. It is one thing to identify a direction or an event. It is another to embed that information into a physical form, ensuring that the alignment is maintained during construction. This requires coordination between observation and building, a way of translating abstract information into concrete action. The structure becomes a record of that information, a fixed point that reflects a pattern in the sky. This transformation from observation to construction suggests a level of planning that connects different aspects of knowledge, astronomy, geometry, and engineering into a unified process. As we consider all of these elements, the solstice alignments, the cardinal orientations, the possible star correlations, and the repetition of these patterns across different cultures, the question begins to take shape. Are these alignments simply the result of careful observation applied independently in different places, or do they reflect a deeper level of understanding, a system of knowledge that connects these sites in ways that are not immediately visible? The answer may lie somewhere between these possibilities, in the intersection of universal observation and cultural interpretation, where similar patterns are recognized and applied in different contexts. But even within this intersection, the level of accuracy achieved suggests that the observation itself was highly developed, that the methods used to track and record celestial movements were effective enough to produce consistent results. And as we sit with this idea, the structures begin to feel different, not just as objects placed on the Earth, but as markers of something larger, points where the ground and the sky are brought into alignment, where human construction reflects patterns that exist beyond it. The stones remain still, but the light that moves across them, the shadows that shift with the sun, the directions they hold, all suggest a connection that is not immediately visible, but becomes clearer with time and attention. And in that connection, the question settles quietly, not as a conclusion, but as an invitation. Whether these alignments are simply the result of observation refined over generations, or whether they reflect a level of understanding that brings the earth and sky together in ways we are still learning to fully see. We leave behind alignments that connect the earth to the sky, to something even more foundational, the patterns that shape those connections, the geometry that appears again and again across civilizations separated by distance, language, and time. When we begin to look at ancient structures not just as individual creations but as expressions of underlying design, a quiet consistency starts to emerge, a preference for certain ratios, certain forms, certain relationships between parts that repeat in ways that feel deliberate rather than accidental. These patterns are not always obvious at first glance, but when measured, compared, and observed carefully, they reveal a shared language, one that does not rely on words, but on proportion, symmetry, and the arrangement of space. Geometry, in this sense, becomes more than a tool for construction. It becomes a way of organizing the world, a method of translating abstract ideas into physical form, creating structures that reflect not only practical needs, but deeper concepts of balance, order, and connection. Across different regions, we find recurring shapes that seem to carry both structural and symbolic meaning. The pyramid, rising from a broad base to a single point, appears in Egypt, in Mesoamerica, and in other forms across the world. Its shape is inherently stable, distributing weight downward while maintaining a clear directional focus upward. This dual quality, stability and ascent, may contribute to its repeated use, offering both practical advantages and symbolic associations. The circle, another recurring form, appears in arrangements like Stonehenge and in countless other contexts, representing continuity, cycles, and unity. Unlike linear forms, the circle has no beginning or end, creating a sense of completeness that resonates across different cultures. These shapes are not complex in themselves, but their consistent appearance suggests that they were recognized as effective and meaningful, integrated into design in ways that go beyond simple functionality. Ratios and proportions add another layer to this pattern. In many ancient structures, the relationships between different dimensions follow consistent patterns, lengths that relate to widths in specific ways, heights that correspond to base measurements, creating a sense of harmony that is both visual and structural. These proportions are not always exact in a modern mathematical sense, but they often approximate relationships that are considered aesthetically pleasing or structurally efficient. The repetition of these ratios across different sites suggests that they were not chosen randomly, but recognized as effective, perhaps through observation, experimentation, and refinement over time. The idea of sacred geometry emerges from this repetition, the notion that certain geometric relationships carry significance beyond their practical application, reflecting patterns that are seen in nature, in growth, in movement, and in the structure of the world itself. Whether or not this concept was formalized in the way we understand it today, the presence of these patterns indicates that geometry was used as a way of connecting design to something larger, creating structures that feel aligned with both the physical and the conceptual. The use of grids and modular systems also appears across different civilizations, providing a framework for organizing space. In some ancient cities, layouts follow a grid pattern, dividing land into sections that can be developed systematically. This approach allows for consistency in construction, making it easier to plan, measure, and build. In other contexts, modular systems are used within structures, repeating units that can be combined to create larger forms. These systems reflect an understanding of how complexity can be built from simplicity, how repeating patterns can create order within a larger design. The presence of such systems suggests that geometry was not only used for individual structures, but for organizing entire environments, creating coherence across different scales. One of the most intriguing aspects of these geometric patterns is their appearance in cultures that had no known direct contact with one another. The question that arises is whether these similarities are the result of independent discovery, or whether they point to some form of shared knowledge that's spread across regions. Independent discovery is certainly possible. Geometry is a natural extension of observation, and the basic principles can be derived from simple interactions with the environment. Measuring lengths, observing angles, recognizing patterns in nature, these are activities that do not require advanced technology but can lead to the development of geometric understanding over time. If different cultures observed similar patterns and faced similar challenges, it is reasonable to expect that they might arrive at similar solutions, developing comparable systems of design independently. At the same time, the consistency of certain patterns raises the possibility that there may have been some level of knowledge exchange, whether direct or indirect. Trade routes, migration, and interaction between cultures can facilitate the spread of ideas, even if the evidence of such exchange is limited. Small pieces of knowledge, shared and adapted, can influence how structures are designed, how space is organized, and how patterns are interpreted. This does not necessarily imply a single, unified system, but rather a network of influences that contribute to the development of similar approaches in different regions. The challenge lies in distinguishing between these possibilities, in determining whether similarities arise from shared conditions or shared knowledge, or a combination of both. The application of geometry in ancient construction also reflects a balance between abstraction and practice. While geometric principles can be expressed in abstract terms, their implementation requires practical methods, tools, and techniques that translate those principles into physical form. This translation is not always straightforward, as it involves adapting idealized shapes to real-world conditions, adjusting for material limitations, environmental factors, and human constraints. The ability to maintain geometric relationships under these conditions suggests that builders had effective ways of measuring, marking, and verifying their work, ensuring that the intended design was achieved despite potential variations. These methods may have involved simple tools, cords, measuring rods, sighting techniques, but their effectiveness lies in how they were used, how they were integrated into the construction process, and how they allowed for consistency across different parts of a structure. As we consider the presence of geometry across civilizations, the repetition of shapes, the use of ratios, the organization of space, and the question of how these patterns developed, the idea of a universal system of design begins to take shape. This system is not necessarily formalized or documented in the way modern systems are, but it exists in the patterns themselves, in the way structures are arranged, in the relationships between their parts. It reflects a way of thinking that recognizes order, balance, and connection as fundamental elements of design, applying these principles in ways that are both practical and meaningful. Whether this system emerged independently in different places or was influenced by shared knowledge, its presence suggests that geometry was more than a tool. It was a framework for understanding and shaping the world. And as we sit with this idea, the structures we have explored begin to feel connected, not through direct links, but through the patterns they share, the principles that underlie their design. The stones, the layouts, the alignments, all reflect a way of organizing space that transcends individual cultures, creating a sense of continuity that is not based on direct contact, but on shared observation and interpretation. And in that continuity, the question remains, not as a definitive conclusion, but as a quiet reflection, whether these patterns are simply the result of similar minds working under similar conditions, or whether they point to a deeper connection, a universal language of design that we are only beginning to fully recognize. We leave behind geometry that shaped space with quiet consistency to something even more abstract yet just as precise, the measurement of time itself, long before clocks, long before written schedules, long before time became something we could hold in numbers and devices. In the ancient world, time was not displayed, it was observed. It moved across the sky, marked by light and shadow, by cycles that repeated with such reliability that they became the foundation for understanding change, seasons, and continuity. The rising and setting of the sun, the shifting phases of the moon, the slow movement of stars across the night, these were not just natural events, but signals, patterns that could be tracked, recorded, and eventually predicted. And in that process of observation, something remarkable began to emerge, systems of timekeeping that were not only functional, but precise, developed without instruments as we know them, yet capable of maintaining consistency over long periods. Ancient calendars are among the clearest expressions of this understanding. In different parts of the world, cultures developed systems to divide time into days, months, and years, often based on the cycles of the sun and moon. The solar year, defined by the time it takes for the Earth to complete one orbit around the sun, was observed through the changing position of sunrise and sunset along the horizon. By marking these positions over time, it became possible to identify key points, solstices and equinoxes that divide the year into segments. These points are not random. They represent the extremes and balances of light, the longest and shortest days, the moments where day and night are equal. Recognizing these points requires careful observation, repeated over multiple years to account for variation and to confirm consistency. Once identified, they can be used as anchors within a calendar, defining the structure of the year and allowing for the prediction of seasonal changes. The lunar cycle offers another layer of timekeeping, one that is shorter and more immediately visible. The phases of the moon change in a regular pattern, from new moon to full moon and back again, completing a cycle in approximately 29.5 days. This cycle is easier to observe on a daily basis, making it useful for tracking shorter periods of time. Many ancient calendars combined solar and lunar observations, creating systems that account for both cycles. This combination introduces complexity, as the lunar cycle does not align perfectly with the solar year, requiring adjustments to maintain synchronization. The presence of such adjustments in ancient calendars suggests an awareness of this discrepancy and a method for correcting it, ensuring that the calendar remains aligned with both celestial patterns. This level of accuracy is not accidental. It reflects sustained observation and the ability to recognize subtle differences over time. Structures themselves often serve as tools for timekeeping, integrating observation directly into their design. At sites aligned with the sun, light enters or interacts with the structure in specific ways on particular days, marking the passage of time through visual cues. Shadows cast by standing stones or pillars can indicate the position of the sun, changing length and direction as the day progresses and as the seasons shift. These effects are not incidental. They are the result of positioning elements in relation to the sun's path, creating a physical representation of time that can be observed without the need for separate instruments. This integration of structure and function transforms buildings into calendars, allowing time to be read through interaction with the environment. The accuracy of these systems is particularly striking when we consider the absence of modern instruments. Without clocks, without precise measuring devices, ancient observers relied on consistency, on the repeated patterns of the sky, and on methods for recording observations over long periods. Markers placed on the horizon, fixed reference points within structures, and repeated observations allowed for the gradual refinement of understanding. Small errors could be corrected over time as patterns became clearer and predictions more reliable. This process requires patience, a willingness to observe without immediate results, and a method for preserving knowledge across generations. The fact that such systems were maintained suggests that this knowledge was valued and transmitted effectively, becoming part of the cultural framework within which these societies operated. Another aspect of ancient timekeeping is its connection to daily life. Calendars were not abstract systems used only for measurement. They were integrated into agriculture, ritual, and social organization. Knowing when to plant, when to harvest, when to prepare for seasonal changes all depended on accurate timekeeping. This practical need reinforces the importance of precision, as errors in timing could have significant consequences. The alignment of structures with celestial events may also have carried symbolic meaning, linking the passage of time with cultural and spiritual practices. This integration of practical and symbolic functions creates a system where time is not only measured, but experienced, observed, and embedded within the environment. As we consider these elements, the calendars, the lunar and solar tracking, the structural alignments, and the accuracy achieved without modern tools, the question begins to take shape. How did these societies achieve such precision through observation alone? The answer lies not in a single method, but in a combination of factors: sustained observation, careful recording, the use of fixed reference points, and the integration of knowledge into both structures and daily life. This combination creates a system that is both simple in its components and complex in its execution, allowing for accurate measurement without reliance on advanced instruments. The consistency of celestial patterns provides a stable foundation, while human observation and interpretation refine that foundation into usable systems. As we sit with this understanding, the idea of timekeeping before timekeeping begins to shift. It is no longer seen as primitive or approximate, but as a different approach to measurement, one that relies on the natural world rather than mechanical devices. This approach does not produce time in the form of numbers on a clock, but in the form of patterns that can be observed and predicted. And in that form, it achieves a level of precision that is both practical and profound, reflecting a deep connection between human perception and the cycles of the environment. And in that connection, the question settles quietly, not as a challenge, but as a reflection, whether measuring time required instruments at all, or whether it required something more fundamental, the ability to observe, to remember, and to align human activity with patterns that have always been present, waiting to be understood. We leave behind the careful measurement of time through sky and shadow, to something more immediate, more tactile, the techniques that shaped the physical world, methods that left behind results we can still see and touch, yet struggle to fully recreate. When we look at ancient stonework, what often stands out is not just the scale or the placement, but the finish, the smoothness of surfaces, the sharpness of edges, the way separate pieces come together with a precision that feels deliberate and controlled. These qualities suggest processes that go beyond basic shaping, involving stages of refinement that require patience, consistency, and a deep familiarity with the material itself. And yet, when modern attempts are made to reproduce these results using tools similar to those believed to have been available at the time, the outcomes, while impressive, often reveal the difficulty of achieving the same level of consistency across large numbers of pieces, raising the question of whether the knowledge behind these techniques was more developed than we currently understand. Stone polishing is one of the most striking examples. In several ancient sites, surfaces appear almost reflective, finished to a degree that suggests prolonged and careful treatment. Achieving such a finish requires more than simply cutting the stone to shape. It involves a sequence of actions, grinding, smoothing, and refining, often using abrasives that gradually reduce irregularities until the surface becomes uniform. This process can be replicated in principle, and experiments have shown that with enough time and effort, similar results can be achieved. But the time required is significant, and maintaining consistency across multiple surfaces introduces additional challenges. Variations in pressure, angle, and material can lead to uneven results requiring further adjustment. The presence of uniformly polished surfaces across entire structures suggests that these variables were controlled effectively, that the process was not only understood but applied with a level of consistency that is difficult to maintain without a well-developed method. Cutting stone presents another layer of complexity. In many ancient structures, cuts appear clean and precise, with edges that meet at consistent angles. In softer stones, this can be achieved with relative ease using simple tools and abrasives. But in harder materials, such as granite or basalt, the process becomes more demanding. Evidence suggests that ancient builders used a combination of techniques, including pounding with harder stones, grinding with abrasives, and possibly using copper or bronze tools in conjunction with sand to create a cutting effect. These methods can produce accurate results, but they require time, repetition, and careful control. When modern researchers attempt to replicate these cuts using similar methods, they often find that while individual examples can be produced, scaling the process to match the volume and consistency seen in ancient structures is significantly more challenging. This gap between isolated success and widespread application points to the importance of process, not just the tools themselves, but the sequence in which they are used, the way tasks are organized, and the level of skill required to maintain quality over time. Fitting stones together without mortar adds yet another dimension to this discussion. In sites where stones are shaped to interlock with minimal gaps, the process involves not only cutting each piece, but adjusting it in relation to others. This requires repeated placement and removal, testing how surfaces meet, identifying points of contact, and refining those points until a precise fit is achieved. The complexity increases when stones are irregular in shape, as each face must correspond to multiple adjacent surfaces. This kind of work cannot rely on standardized measurements alone. It depends on direct interaction with the material, on observation and adjustment, on a feedback loop where each step informs the next. Maintaining this level of precision across an entire structure suggests that the process was well understood, that builders had developed techniques for identifying and correcting deviations, ensuring that each piece contributed to the overall stability and alignment. The idea of lost craftsmanship traditions emerges from these observations. In many ancient societies, knowledge was transmitted through practice rather than written instruction. Skills were learned by doing, by observing experienced artisans, by repeating processes until they became intuitive. This form of knowledge is highly effective, allowing for the preservation of techniques across generations, but it is also fragile. If the chain of transmission is broken, if the context in which the skill is practiced changes, the knowledge can be lost even if the results remain visible. This creates a situation where we can see what was achieved, but not fully understand how it was done, because the methods were never recorded in a way that allows for direct reconstruction. The absence of detailed written instructions does not mean that the knowledge was incomplete. On the contrary, it suggests that the knowledge was embedded in practice, in the hands and experience of those who used it. Modern attempts to replicate ancient techniques often highlight this difference. With access to advanced tools and materials, it is possible to achieve results that match or exceed ancient precision, but doing so does not necessarily reveal how those results were originally achieved. When researchers limit themselves to tools and methods believed to have been available in the past, the process becomes more challenging. Experiments may succeed in reproducing certain features, but they often require extended time, careful planning, and repeated trials to reach the desired outcome. These efforts demonstrate that the techniques are possible, but they also reveal the level of commitment and skill required to apply them consistently. The gap between possibility and routine application suggests that ancient builders may have operated within systems that supported the development and maintenance of these skills, systems that allowed for specialization, for the accumulation of experience, and for the refinement of methods over time. Another factor to consider is the integration of these techniques into a broader process. Stone cutting, polishing, and fitting are not isolated tasks. They are part of a sequence that includes material selection, transport, placement, and alignment. Each stage influences the others, creating a system where the quality of the final result depends on the coordination of multiple steps. This coordination requires planning, communication, and a shared understanding of the desired outcome. In the absence of written instructions, this understanding must be conveyed through practice, through demonstration, and through a common framework that guides the work. The presence of consistent results across large structures suggests that such frameworks existed, allowing for the effective integration of techniques into a cohesive process. As we bring these observations together, the polished surfaces, the precise cuts, the tight fittings, and the challenges faced in modern replication, the question begins to take shape. Were these techniques truly lost, or have we simply lost the context in which they were practiced? The knowledge may not have been written, but it was clearly present, applied with skill and consistency to produce results that endure. This suggests that the limitation is not in the tools themselves, but in our understanding of how they were used, in the absence of the traditions that supported their application. And as we sit with this idea, the image of ancient craftsmanship begins to shift. It is no longer seen as simple or primitive, but as deeply practiced, refined through repetition, and embedded within systems that allowed for the transmission of skill across generations. The techniques may appear elusive today, but their results remain, offering a quiet reminder that knowledge does not always take the form of written records. that it can exist in practice, in experience, in the subtle adjustments made by skilled hands. And in that realization, the question settles gently, not as a challenge, but as a reflection, whether what we struggle to replicate is not the result itself, but the way of knowing that made it possible. We leave behind techniques that feel just out of reach, to something quieter, less visible, yet perhaps more revealing. The absence of explanation, the silence that surrounds so many of these achievements. When we search the past for instructions, for detailed manuals or clear blueprints that describe how structures were built, how systems were designed, or how precise methods were applied, we often find very little. What remains are the results, the stones fitted together, the channels carved into rock, the alignments set with care, but the processes behind them are rarely preserved in a way that can be followed step by step. This absence does not mean that the knowledge did not exist. It suggests something else, that the way knowledge was held, shared, and valued may have been very different from what we expect today, where documentation is often considered essential for preservation. In many ancient societies, knowledge was not something written down in detail, but something lived, practiced, and passed directly from one person to another, forming a chain that depended on continuity rather than record. This way of knowing is effective while it remains unbroken, but when it is interrupted, when a community changes, disperses, or disappears, the knowledge can fade quickly, leaving behind only the evidence of what it once produced. The idea of building without blueprints can feel unfamiliar, especially when modern construction relies heavily on detailed plans, measurements, and documentation that guide every stage of a project. But in a context where knowledge is embedded in practice, where skills are learned through repetition and observation, the need for written instructions is reduced. A builder does not necessarily need a diagram if they have seen the process many times, if they understand the sequence of actions, if they can recognize the correct outcome through experience. In such a system, knowledge is not externalized in documents, but internalized in people, carried in memory, in muscle, in the subtle adjustments made during work. This creates a form of expertise that is difficult to capture in writing, as it depends on context, on judgment, on the ability to respond to variations in material and an environment, and the absence of manuals in the historical record may reflect this mode of transmission, where the process was not something to be recorded, but something to be practiced. Oral traditions play a central role in this kind of system. Stories, instructions, and techniques can be passed through spoken language, often embedded within narratives that carry both practical and cultural meaning. These traditions can be highly detailed, preserving information across generations without the need for written text. But they are also vulnerable. Unlike written records, which can endure even when their creators are gone, oral traditions depend on continuous transmission. If that chain is broken, if the people who hold the knowledge are lost, the information can disappear entirely. This vulnerability becomes more pronounced during periods of disruption, when societies face environmental changes, conflict, or migration. In such moments, the priority may shift from preserving knowledge to immediate survival, and the continuity of transmission can be interrupted. When that happens, the knowledge does not vanish all at once, but begins to fragment, losing detail over time until only traces remain, hints within stories, fragments within practices that no longer carry their original context. The reasons why knowledge disappears are varied, and they often intersect in complex ways. Environmental changes can alter the conditions that made certain techniques relevant, leading to their gradual abandonment. If a system is no longer needed, the knowledge associated with it may not be maintained with the same level of care, eventually fading from use. Social changes can have a similar effect. When communities reorganize, when new systems replace older ones, certain skills may become less central, and the structures that supported their transmission may weaken. Conflict and displacement can accelerate this process, disrupting communities and breaking the chains through which knowledge is passed. In some cases, knowledge may be intentionally withheld or restricted, shared only within specific groups, which can protect it in the short term, but make it more vulnerable if those groups are affected. Over time, these factors can combine, creating gaps in the historical record that are not immediately visible, but become apparent when we look for explanations that are no longer there. The absence of written records also reflects the priorities of those who did record information. In many ancient societies, writing was used for specific purposes: administration, trade, ritual, or the recording of significant events. Technical details of construction or craftsmanship may not have been considered necessary to document, especially if they were widely understood within the community. This creates a bias in the historical record, where certain types of information are preserved while others are not. What survives is shaped by what was valued at the time and what was considered worth recording. As a result, we may have detailed accounts of rulers, events, and beliefs, while the processes that produce the physical structures around them remain largely undocumented. This imbalance contributes to the sense of silence, where the results are visible but the methods are not. Modern archaeology and historical research attempt to fill these gaps by studying the evidence that remains, analyzing materials, examining construction techniques, and conducting experiments to understand how certain results might have been achieved. These efforts can provide valuable insights, reconstructing processes based on physical traces and comparative analysis. But reconstruction is not the same as direct knowledge. It involves interpretation, the use of available evidence to build plausible explanations rather than the recovery of exact methods. This means that multiple interpretations can exist, each supported by different aspects of the evidence, without a single definitive answer. The absence of original documentation leaves room for uncertainty, where the process must be inferred rather than known with certainty. As we consider this silence, the absence of manuals, the loss of oral traditions, the reasons why knowledge disappears, the idea begins to take shape that history, as we understand it, is not a complete record of everything that once existed. It is a collection of what has survived, shaped by preservation, by selection, by chance. The structures that remain are part of that record, but they represent outcomes, not necessarily the processes that created them. This distinction is important, as it reminds us that what we see is not the full story, but a fragment, a result that carries within it traces of methods that are no longer fully visible. And in that distinction there is a quiet shift in perspective. Instead of asking only how something was done, we begin to consider why that knowledge was not preserved in the way we expect, what conditions led to its disappearance, and how those conditions shape our understanding of the past. As this idea settles, the silence itself becomes meaningful, not as an absence, but as a presence, a reminder of the limits of the record and of the complexity that lies beyond it. The lack of detailed instructions does not diminish the achievements we observe. If anything, it highlights the depth of knowledge that must have existed to produce them, knowledge that was real, effective, and widely applied, even if it was not written down. And in that realization, the question lingers softly, not as a challenge, but as a reflection, whether what we are missing is not evidence of ability, but evidence of how that ability was understood, practiced, and ultimately lost, leaving behind results that speak clearly, even as the processes remain quiet, just beyond our reach. We leave behind the silence in the records, to something that may explain that silence, the moments when entire civilizations change course, fragment, or disappear, taking with them not only their people, but the knowledge they carried. When we think of history, we often imagine continuity, one culture leading into another, knowledge accumulating, building steadily over time. But across the world, there are points where that continuity seems to break, where cities are abandoned, systems collapse, and the structures that once supported daily life fall into disuse. These moments are not always dramatic in the way we expect. There is not always clear evidence of destruction, no single event that marks the end. Instead, the change can be gradual, subtle, unfolding over years or decades until what once functioned as a complex society becomes something quieter, smaller, or entirely absent. And in that transition, something important happens, not just the loss of population or infrastructure, but the loss of knowledge, the systems of understanding that allowed that society to function at its previous level. The Maya civilization provides one of the most studied examples of this kind of transformation. At its height, it developed sophisticated cities, advanced calendar systems, and architectural achievements that reflect deep knowledge of astronomy and environment. Yet many of these cities were eventually abandoned, their populations declining or relocating, leaving behind structures that remain but are no longer used. The reasons for this shift are complex, involving environmental stress, resource depletion, and social factors that disrupted the balance required to sustain large urban centers. As these pressures increased, the systems that supported the civilization began to weaken, and with that weakening came changes in how knowledge was maintained and transmitted. Skills that were once central to daily life may have become less relevant or more difficult to sustain, leading to their gradual disappearance. The structures remain as evidence of what was achieved, but the processes behind them become less visible, fading as the context that supported them changes. The Indus Valley civilization presents a different kind of mystery, one where the decline appears to have occurred without clear signs of conflict or sudden catastrophe. Cities that were once organized with advanced urban planning, drainage systems, and standardized construction show signs of gradual abandonment. The reasons are still debated, with possibilities including shifts in climate, changes in river systems, and disruptions to trade networks. What is notable is not only the decline itself, but the way it affects the continuity of knowledge. The systems that once coordinated urban life, the standards that ensured consistency in construction, the practices that maintained infrastructure, all depend on a stable social structure. When that structure changes, the mechanisms for preserving and transmitting knowledge can weaken, leading to fragmentation. Over time, the coherence that once defined the civilization becomes less distinct, replaced by smaller, less connected communities that may retain some aspects of the original system but not its full complexity. Other civilizations show similar patterns, each with its own combination of causes and effects. Environmental changes, such as prolonged droughts or shifts in temperature, can alter the conditions that support agriculture, leading to shortages that affect population and stability. Resource depletion can reduce the availability of materials needed for construction or trade, limiting the ability to maintain existing systems. Social and political changes can disrupt the organization of labor and the distribution of knowledge, creating gaps in continuity. External pressures, such as migration or conflict, can accelerate these processes, introducing new variables that further destabilize existing structures. In each case, the result is not simply a decline in physical structures, but a transformation in how knowledge is held and used. The idea that knowledge disappears with societies is not always immediately visible because some aspects of knowledge can persist in modified forms. Techniques may be adapted, simplified, or integrated into new contexts, creating a continuity that is partial rather than complete. However, certain types of knowledge, particularly those that require complex systems or specialized skills, may be more vulnerable. If the conditions that support their practice are no longer present, they may not be maintained, and over time, they can be lost entirely. This loss is not necessarily intentional. It is often a byproduct of change, a consequence of shifting priorities and circumstances. When survival becomes the primary concern, maintaining specialized knowledge may become less feasible, leading to its gradual disappearance. The concept of cycles of rise and fall emerges from these patterns, suggesting that civilizations do not always progress in a single direction, but can experience periods of growth followed by periods of decline. During times of stability and abundance, knowledge can expand, systems can become more complex, and new techniques can be developed and refined. During times of stress or disruption, these systems can contract, simplify, or disappear, leading to a loss of complexity that may take generations to rebuild. This cyclical pattern does not imply that all progress is undone, but it does suggest that progress is not guaranteed to be permanent, that it depends on conditions that can change over time. The structures that remain from past civilizations provide a record of these cycles, showing what was achieved during periods of growth, while the gaps in knowledge reflect the transitions that followed. As we consider these patterns, the idea of a reset begins to take shape, not as a complete return to an earlier state, but as a transformation that alters the trajectory of development. After a period of decline, new systems may emerge, drawing on what remains of previous knowledge while adapting to new conditions. This process can create the appearance of continuity as elements of the past are incorporated into new forms, but it also introduces differences, changes in emphasis, in method, in scope. Over time, the connection to the original system may become less direct as new layers of development are added, and the memory of earlier techniques fades. The result is a history that appears continuous, but is in fact composed of multiple phases, each shaped by its own conditions and influences. The question that arises from this perspective is not whether progress occurs, but how it is maintained, and what happens when the conditions that support it change. The examples of the Maya, the Indus Valley, and other civilizations suggest that progress is closely tied to stability, to the ability to sustain systems over time. When that stability is disrupted, the continuity of knowledge can be affected, leading to changes that are not always immediately visible in the structures that remain. This raises the possibility that some of the techniques and understandings we observe in ancient structures may have been part of systems that no longer exist, systems that were disrupted or transformed in ways that led to the loss of certain types of knowledge. And as we sit with this idea, the narrative of steady progress begins to shift, not disappearing, but becoming more complex, allowing for the possibility that history includes not only growth, but interruption, not only accumulation, but loss. The structures that remain stand as markers of what was achieved, but they also point to what is no longer present, the knowledge that once supported them, the systems that allowed them to be created and maintained. And in that contrast, the question settles quietly, not as a conclusion, but as a reflection, whether what we see as advancement is always moving forward, or whether it sometimes moves in cycles, rising, fading, and rising again, leaving behind traces that remind us that progress, like the civilizations that create it, may not be as permanent as we assume. We leave behind civilizations that rose, transformed, and sometimes quietly reset, to a question that lingers across everything we've seen, not tied to one place or one moment, but stretching across the entire world, the question of pattern, of whether the similarities we observe are simply coincidence or something more connected, more intentional than we first assume. When we look back across the structures, the techniques, the alignments, and the systems we've explored, a quiet repetition begins to form, not in exact copies, but in shared principles, ideas that appear again and again in different forms, across cultures that did not share language, distance, or direct contact in any obvious way. These repetitions are not always immediately visible, but when we begin to compare, to place one example alongside another, the similarities start to gather, creating a sense that something is being echoed, not perfectly, but consistently enough to be noticed. The question is not whether each individual example can be explained on its own, but whether the accumulation of these examples begins to suggest a larger pattern, one that extends beyond isolated cases. When we revisit engineering, for example, we find that different civilizations approach similar challenges in ways that produce comparable results. Massive stones are shaped and placed with precision. Structures are designed to endure environmental stress. Systems are created to manage water, to control flow, to maintain balance over time. These solutions are practical, responding to the demands of the environment and the limitations of available tools. But the way they are implemented often reflects a level of refinement that feels consistent across different contexts. The details may vary, the materials may change, but the underlying approach, the emphasis on precision, on integration, on long-term stability, appears again and again. This repetition suggests that certain principles of engineering were recognized as effective, not just in one place, but in multiple locations, developed through observation and applied in ways that produce similar outcomes. Alignment adds another layer to this pattern. Structures oriented toward the sun, the stars, or the cardinal directions appear in different parts of the world, each reflecting a connection between the built environment and the sky. These alignments are not identical, but they share a common foundation, the observation of celestial movements, and the translation of those movements into fixed points on the ground. The consistency of this approach suggests that the sky served as a universal reference, a stable system that could be observed by anyone, anywhere, and used to organize space in a meaningful way. The presence of such alignments across different cultures raises the question of whether this knowledge was developed independently in each case, or whether there was some form of shared understanding that influenced its use. Geometry, as we have seen, provides a framework that ties these elements together. The use of proportion, symmetry, and repeating patterns appears across civilizations, creating structures that feel balanced and coherent. These geometric principles are not tied to a specific culture, but can be derived from observation and reasoning, making independent discovery possible. At the same time, the consistency of certain ratios and forms suggests that once these principles were recognized, they were applied in ways that reinforce their effectiveness, creating a sense of continuity that extends beyond individual examples. The combination of engineering, alignment, and geometry creates a network of similarities that is difficult to ignore, not because any single example is unexplained, but because the accumulation of these examples begins to form a pattern that feels larger than coincidence alone. The idea of independent development offers one explanation for these similarities. Human beings, regardless of location, share certain cognitive abilities, the capacity to observe, to measure, to recognize patterns, and to apply those patterns in practical ways. Given similar challenges, building stable structures, managing resources, organizing space, it is reasonable to expect that similar solutions might emerge. The environment also plays a role, as certain conditions favor certain approaches, leading to convergent development, where different groups arrive at similar outcomes through different paths. This perspective emphasizes the universality of human experience, suggesting that the patterns we see are a reflection of shared ways of thinking and problem-solving. But as the number of similarities increases, another possibility begins to take shape, that of connection, of knowledge that may have been shared, directly or indirectly, across regions. Trade routes, migration, and cultural exchange can facilitate the movement of ideas, even if the evidence of such exchange is not always clear. Small pieces of knowledge transmitted and adapted can influence how structures are designed, how systems are organized, and how patterns are interpreted. Over time, these influences can create similarities that extend beyond what would be expected from independent development alone. This does not require a single unified system or a direct link between all cultures, but it does suggest that the flow of knowledge may be more complex than a simple model of isolation. The challenge lies in distinguishing between these explanations, in determining whether a given similarity is the result of shared conditions or shared knowledge. This is not always possible with certainty, as the evidence can support multiple interpretations. What we can observe, however, is the pattern itself, the repetition of certain principles across different contexts, and the way these principles combine to produce results that feel consistent. This pattern does not provide a definitive answer, but it does raise the question of whether coincidence alone is sufficient to explain it. As we consider this question, it becomes clear that the answer may not be one or the other, but a combination of factors. Independent discovery and connection are not mutually exclusive. It is possible that certain principles were discovered independently in different places, while others were influenced by interaction and exchange. The resulting pattern is a blend of these processes, a network of similarities that reflects both the universality of human thought and the complexity of cultural interaction. This perspective allows for a more nuanced understanding, one that recognizes the multiple pathways through which knowledge can develop and spread. As we sit with this idea, the structures we have explored begin to feel less isolated, not because they are directly linked, but because they share a common language, a set of principles that can be recognized across distance and time. The stones, the alignments, the proportions, all contribute to this language, creating a sense of continuity that is not dependent on direct contact, but on shared ways of understanding the world. And in that continuity, the question remains, not as a conclusion, but as an invitation to look more closely, to consider the possibility that what we are seeing is not a series of coincidences, but a pattern that reflects something deeper, something that connects these places in ways that are not immediately visible. The pattern does not reveal its full meaning at once. It unfolds gradually through comparison, through observation, through the recognition of repetition. And as it unfolds, it invites us to reconsider the way we think about the past, not as a collection of isolated achievements, but as a network of ideas that may be more connected than we have yet fully understood, leaving us with the quiet awareness that there may be too many patterns to ignore, and that within those patterns there may be a story that is still waiting to be seen. We leave behind patterns that seem too consistent to ignore, to a possibility that reshapes how we understand all of them, the idea that knowledge itself may not move forward in a straight line, but in cycles, rising, reaching a level of mastery, fading, and then returning in forms that feel new but may not be entirely original. When we think of progress, we often imagine accumulation, each discovery building on the last, each generation adding to a growing body of understanding that moves steadily forward. But when we look more closely at the historical record and at the gaps within it, another pattern begins to appear, one that is less linear and more rhythmic, where knowledge expands under certain conditions, stabilizes as it becomes widely applied, and then, under pressure or disruption, begins to fragment, leaving behind traces that may later be rediscovered and interpreted as new. This pattern does not suggest that all knowledge is lost or that every advancement is repeated, but it does introduce the possibility that some forms of understanding may have existed before, reached a level of refinement, and then faded, only to reappear in different contexts. The cycle often begins with observation and experimentation, a period where new ideas emerge, driven by curiosity, necessity, or a combination of both. During this phase, knowledge is fluid, adaptable, and often closely tied to the environment in which it develops. As these ideas are tested and refined, they can lead to a phase of mastery, where techniques become consistent, systems are established, and the application of knowledge becomes more efficient and reliable. This is the stage where we often see the most visible achievements, structures that reflect precision, systems that function effectively, and a level of integration that suggests a deep understanding of the underlying principles. But mastery also introduces stability, and with stability can come a shift in focus from discovery to maintenance, from experimentation to preservation. Over time, this stability can make systems more rigid, less adaptable to change, and more dependent on the conditions that allowed them to develop in the first place. When those conditions begin to shift, whether due to environmental changes, social transformations, or external pressures, the systems that rely on them can become vulnerable. The knowledge that supports them may still exist, but its application may become more difficult, less relevant, or harder to sustain. As this process continues, knowledge can begin to fragment. Techniques that once required coordinated effort and shared understanding may become isolated, practiced by fewer individuals, or simplified to fit new conditions. The loss is not always immediate or complete. It can occur gradually as certain aspects are maintained while others fade, creating a partial continuity that preserves some elements while losing others. Over time, the connection to the original system may weaken and the knowledge that remains may no longer be recognized in its original form. This is the phase of collapse, not necessarily a sudden event, but a transition where complexity is reduced and the systems that supported it are no longer fully present. What remains are fragments, structures, artifacts, and partial techniques that hint at what once existed but do not fully explain it. The cycle does not end here. In later periods, these fragments can become the starting point for rediscovery. New generations encounter the remains of earlier systems, observe their results, and attempt to understand how they were achieved. This process can lead to the development of new techniques that approximate or reinterpret the original methods, creating the appearance of innovation. In some cases, the rediscovered knowledge may align closely with what existed before, while in others, it may diverge, influenced by different conditions, tools, and perspectives. The key point is that the knowledge is not entirely new, but re-emerges from what has been preserved, adapted to fit a new context. This creates a layered history where multiple cycles overlap, each contributing to the overall trajectory, but not always in a straight line. When we apply this idea to the examples we have explored, the patterns begin to align in a different way. The precision of ancient stonework, the complexity of water systems, the alignment of structures with celestial events, these may represent phases of mastery within earlier cycles, points where knowledge was applied with a level of refinement that reflects sustained development. The gaps in the record, the difficulty in replicating certain techniques, and the absence of detailed documentation may reflect the transitions between cycles where knowledge was not fully preserved in a form that could be easily transmitted. The modern attempts to understand and recreate these techniques can be seen as part of a rediscovery phase where fragments of earlier knowledge are being examined, interpreted, and integrated into contemporary understanding. This perspective does not diminish modern achievements, but it places them within a broader context where innovation and rediscovery coexist, each contributing to the development of knowledge over time. Modern parallels can be found in various fields where techniques or ideas that were once common become less visible, only to be revisited later. Traditional construction methods, for example, have in some cases been replaced by faster, more standardized approaches, leading to a loss of certain skills. In recent years, there has been renewed interest in these methods, not because they are new, but because their value is being recognized again. Similarly, practices related to sustainability and environmental integration, which were once inherent in many traditional systems, are being rediscovered as modern challenges highlight the limitations of more recent approaches. These examples suggest that the cycle of knowledge is not confined to the distant past, but continues in the present, reflecting the ongoing interaction between development, change, and rediscovery. As we consider the idea of cyclical knowledge, the question begins to shift. Instead of asking whether ancient people were more advanced or whether modern methods are superior, we begin to ask how knowledge moves, how it is maintained, how it changes, and how it can be lost and found again. This shift allows for a more dynamic understanding of history, one that recognizes the complexity of development and the factors that influence it. It suggests that progress is not simply a matter of accumulation, but of continuity, adaptation, and the ability to sustain knowledge across changing conditions. When that continuity is disrupted, the cycle begins again with new observations, new interpretations, and the gradual reconstruction of what was once known. As this idea settles, quietly, without demanding a definitive conclusion, the patterns we have observed take on a new dimension. The structures, the techniques, the alignments all become part of a larger process, one that extends beyond individual examples and into the movement of knowledge itself. And in that movement, the possibility emerges that what we often see as invention may, in some cases, be rediscovery, a return to principles that have been encountered before, refined in different ways, and applied under new conditions. The question that remains is not whether this cycle exists, but how often it occurs, and how much of what we know today may be part of a pattern that has repeated more than once. And as that question lingers, softly, without urgency, it invites a different way of looking at the past and the present. Not as separate points on a line, but as phases within a cycle, where knowledge rises, fades, and returns, reminding us that what we are learning may not always be entirely new, but part of something that has been unfolding for far longer than we can easily see. We leave behind the idea that knowledge may move in cycles to something quieter, more unsettling, the possibility that even with everything we've uncovered, measured, and explained, something may still be missing from the story itself. Not a single discovery, not a hidden object waiting to be found, but a gap in perspective, a way of seeing the past that may not fully account for what we are actually looking at. Across everything we have explored, the precision of stone, the movement of massive structures, the alignment with the sky, the control of water, the patterns of geometry, and the cycles of rise and fall, there has been a consistent thread, not one of contradiction, but of quiet tension, a sense that the explanations we have are often sufficient, but not always complete. They tell us how something could have been done, but not always how it was done, in the way we observe it, repeatedly, consistently, across different contexts. And within that difference between possibility and practice, a question begins to form, not loud or urgent, but steady and persistent. Whether what we understand about ancient civilizations reflects their full capability, or only the portion that fits within the framework we have built to interpret them. The idea that ancient humans were primitive is not one that is stated directly, but it often underlies how we interpret their achievements. When we see complex results, we look for simple explanations, not because the results are simple, but because we assume the tools and knowledge must have been limited. This approach works in many cases, providing reasonable and evidence-based explanations that align with what we know about materials, tools, and environment. But when the results begin to cluster, when precision appears again and again, when systems function at scales that require coordination and consistency, when alignments reflect sustained observation over time, the idea of limitation begins to shift, not disappearing but becoming less certain, less fixed. It becomes possible to consider that the capabilities of ancient people were not defined solely by the tools we have identified, but by how those tools were used, by the knowledge that guided their use, and by systems of understanding that may not be fully visible in the surviving record. This shift does not require us to replace established explanations, but to expand them, to allow for the possibility that the context in which these achievements occurred included factors that are not always captured in the evidence we have. The absence of detailed records, the loss of oral traditions, and the fragmentation of knowledge across time all contribute to this uncertainty. We see the results clearly, but the processes remain partially hidden, reconstructed through inference rather than preserved directly. This creates a situation where our understanding is shaped as much by what is missing as by what is present. The gaps in the record do not necessarily indicate something extraordinary, but they do limit the completeness of the narrative, leaving room for interpretations that acknowledge both what we know and what we do not. As we bring together the elements we have explored, the engineering, the alignment, the geometry, the timekeeping, the lost techniques, the cycles of civilization, a pattern emerges, not one that points to a single conclusion, but one that suggests a level of coherence in ancient achievements that is difficult to attribute to isolated developments alone. This coherence does not imply a single origin or a unified system, but it does indicate that certain principles were recognized and applied in ways that produced consistent results. Whether these principles were discovered independently or shared through interaction, their presence reflects a depth of understanding that goes beyond simple trial and error. It suggests a relationship between observation, knowledge, and application that is more integrated than we often assume. The idea that history may have missed something does not mean that it is fundamentally incorrect, but that it may be incomplete in subtle ways. The framework we use to understand the past is built from available evidence, organized into a narrative that connects events and developments into a coherent whole. This framework is valuable, allowing us to make sense of complex information, but it also shapes what we look for and how we interpret what we find. If certain types of knowledge were not preserved in forms that align with this framework, they may be underrepresented or overlooked, not because they were insignificant, but because they do not fit easily into the categories we use to define progress. This creates the possibility that some aspects of ancient capability remain partially hidden, not in the sense of being deliberately concealed, but in the sense of being embedded in results that we have not fully decoded. As we sit with this idea, the past begins to feel less distant, not because it becomes identical to the present, but because the gap between them becomes more nuanced. Ancient people are no longer seen as operating within a narrow range of ability, but as working within systems of knowledge that were adapted to their environment, refined through practice, and capable of producing results that continue to hold their form. This perspective does not diminish modern achievements, but it places them within a broader continuum where different periods may excel in different ways, and where the measure of advancement is not always linear or uniform. The structures we see today are not just remnants of a simpler time, but evidence of what was possible within different conditions, using different approaches, guided by knowledge that may have been more sophisticated than we fully recognize. The question that remains is not one that demands a definitive answer. It does not ask us to choose between competing explanations or to replace one narrative with another. Instead, it invites a shift in perspective, a willingness to hold uncertainty alongside understanding, to recognize that the story of the past is shaped by both what is known and what is missing. It suggests that the most meaningful insights may come not from filling every gap with certainty, but from acknowledging the limits of what we can currently explain and remaining open to the possibility that there is more to discover, not only in new findings, but in how we interpret what is already in front of us. As the structures remain, as the patterns persist, as the questions continue quietly in the background, the idea settles into something less like a conclusion and more like a reflection, one that does not close the story, but leaves it gently open. And in that openness, the final thought arrives, slowly, almost like an echo of everything that came before, not as a statement, but as a quiet realization that lingers long after the details have faded. Maybe the question isn't how advanced they were, but how much we've forgotten.